So we're starting to get to anarchy and chaos in Sri Lanka. Well, unfortunately, the situation has now got much worse, and the country is now on the verge of collapse. The new Prime Minister has announced that they have run out of currency entirely, and they only have enough gasoline supplies to last for one more day. So this is a country that is now on the verge of complete chaos. And in recent videos, I talked about the protests that had started against the current president, and those protests now have got violent, and unfortunately people are starting to die. And I'll tell you later about an MP that was reportedly beaten to death by an angry mob. In terms of what impact this will have on the global economy, well, this is bad news because Sri Lanka have already defaulted on their debt, so they won't be paying that back, and this will have contagion. So the rating agencies will now be nervous that other countries are going to follow Sri Lanka, and in all likelihood they will, because what's happening in Ukraine right now has caused the price of oil and food to spike, and most countries around the world can't afford those price increases. So we will see more defaults, and we will see more countries needing a bailout. And ultimately, somebody has to pay for that bailout, and it will be the Western world. So this is basically just adding more debt into the global economy, and it's highly likely that we will be heading towards a global recession at some point either later in 2022 or early 2023. And Cuba is another country that is now suffering because of the massive increases that we've seen in the price of food commodities and oil as a direct result of this war. Cuba is clearly suffering as a result of what's going on in Ukraine. We have got a major increase in food prices and oil prices, and they are the main commodities that Cuba has to import. Kazakhstan, which is the 8th largest exporter of wheat globally, recently announced that it was banning all wheat exports, and it's very possible that we could see other countries follow suit. And if we do see countries starting to take a nationalist perspective and protect their own population, then the situation could get significantly worse, because a lot of countries are absolutely dependent on the import of wheat for the supply of food for their population. We've now got gaps in the global supply chain, and India stepping into the breach by allowing some of its surplus to be exported was really going to help balance this global supply network. But unfortunately, the circumstances in India have led to the removal of those potential exports. We've got a triple whammy of a heat wave, a rise in inflation, and a fall in the value of the Indian rupee. And all of those factors have led the Indian authorities to now place that ban on wheat exports. So that means we're back to square one in terms of the amount of available wheat globally. And of course, when you get a situation like this, it has knock-on impacts. So the price of wheat is likely to go up even higher now because there is nobody to fill that gap that India was previously going to fill. And also, we may see other countries coming out and announcing similar bans. Specifically, why I wanted to talk about Iran today is that they've started encountering civil unrest and riots as a result of an increase in bread prices. So this is a food-related matter. And it's interesting that when we've talked about all the other countries around the world who are having problems right now, it's predominantly food that's bringing everything to the fore. That's what's causing people to protest and riot, and potentially could see a lot of change of governments as a result of increase in food prices. So it's not gasoline and all of the other issues that you might expect would cause this. It's food. It's a basic requirement for life. Tunisia is now at the point of potential financial ruin. The country has been struggling for a long period of time, and what's happened in Ukraine is really now bringing everything to a head and potentially putting them at the risk of collapse. Well, the impact of the COVID pandemic was devastating on the global economy, and it meant that a lot of central banks reduced their official rate of interest to virtually zero. So that made borrowing very cheap. And at the same time, a lot of countries introduced quantitative easing programs to try to stimulate growth. So that meant that there was plenty of cash available for borrowing at very low interest rates. So that's led to a boom in household debt, and also companies have been borrowing heavily as well. So at the start of 2022, we were already sitting at a situation with relatively high rates of inflation. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw a spike in oil prices, gas prices, food prices, and commodity prices. And that's really accentuated the problem that we had with inflation at that time. Where we are right now is that inflation is now hitting emergency levels. We can't carry on with the rates of inflation that we're seeing just now. So as a result, a lot of central banks are now taking drastic action, and we are seeing rapid increases in interest rates. 50 basis point increases could become the norm over the next 6 months or so. At the same time as those interest rate increases, we're also seeing a lot of the central banks deciding that they need to reverse their quantitative easing programs. So we're going to see a contraction in the supply of cash in those economies. And the impact of those interest rate increases and reduction of QE is going to have a really negative impact on the economy. We're going to see economies contract rapidly, and we could easily see a global recession kicking in within the next 6 months. Well, clearly the latest inflation figures that we're seeing from Turkey are very concerning. 70% inflation is off the scale. This is right up there in terms of the world levels of inflation. I recently showed you a table that had the top 10 countries in terms of inflation, and Turkey is right up there alongside Venezuela and lots of other crazy countries. So 70% really is not sustainable. It's impossible for the people of Turkey to be able to afford to keep paying for things when prices are rising so rapidly. What's happening is we've got a really rapid domino effect that's hitting all of these economies simultaneously. And when you get a simultaneous fall in a number of different economies, it then all adds up to a global recession. So Pakistan is now sitting on the edge of a collapse. We've got a country that is running out of foreign currency rapidly. It's got high rates of inflation. It's going to struggle to be able to pay its fuel bills over the next 3 to 6 months. And it's likely that we will see a situation in Pakistan that we saw in Sri Lanka recently. And now the impact is hitting South America. And this week we have seen a lot of protests from the population of Peru, who are unhappy about rising fuel, fertilizer and food costs. And some of those protests turned violent and the army got involved, and the government announced a state of emergency and a 24-hour curfew. So we're starting to see the same problems in Peru as we've seen in the other two countries that I've focused in on, where basic essentials are becoming unaffordable for most of the population, and that's causing civil unrest and potential political turmoil in the country.